In early March, I held what has become an annual lecture on conflict-related sexual violence for students from across law and social sciences at the University of Oslo, as part of the course Criminological Perspectives on Gender, Sexuality, and Violence. Meeting students for the first time, again in a physical classroom for a really long time due to the pandemic, and a few weeks into the new and raw reality of war in Europe, even in the safe and peaceful confines of an auditorium here in Oslo, immersed in the minute-by-minute reporting from the war zone, the lecture too felt raw, a bit too close, perhaps. At the time, confirmed reports of sexual violence had not yet surfaced from the Russian invasion, but the students expected that it was a question of when and not if that would be the case. I was not then comfortable with such speculations. Sexual violence is widespread in many wars, and many factors of immediate reporting suggested that sexual violence was imminent in Ukraine. But sexual violence is not inevitable in wars, and without confirmed reports, I hesitated. A few days later, however, I read the first reports of sexual violence by Russian soldiers. Over the next few weeks and months, some of these stories resurfaced in politicians' statements, in Human Rights Watch reports, at the UN, and in the media. Both President Zelensky and Foreign Minister Kuleba have told of women, girls, and babies being raped and killed. Parallel investigations into atrocities against the civilian population are currently underway, headed by the UN, the ICC, and domestic officials. And while I will not go into details, these allegations, reports, and investigations form the backdrop and part of today's lecture. I'm Anette Bringedal Houge. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Health and Society at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Oslo, and a guest researcher at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law, conducting research and evidence in the prosecution of rape here in Norway. Moreover, I have recently conducted and published research on the prospects and limitations of torture rehabilitation for refugees in Norway, and on research ethics and trauma and violence research. Prior to my current position, I was the head of humanitarian analysis at the Norwegian Red Cross, and I have a PhD in criminology on the knowledge production, implications, and meaning of the fight against impunity and international criminal justice following war crimes and crimes against humanity, specializing particularly on sexual violence and the aftermath of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Now, this means that while this lecture has sexual violence in Ukraine as its outset, I am neither an expert on Ukraine or the ongoing war, nor am I a psychologist or a health professional. So what I will do here is roughly to sketch out or offer some reflections from my own research in this broader field, building on the expertise of numerous others, and I will do so in thematic sections pertaining to sexual violence as conflict-related and its emergence from periphery to center in war reporting and responses, moving on to critical perspectives on justice, particularly the role of criminal justice in this process, and then I will also address the cross-border refugee situation, touch upon lessons from the recent past pertaining to sexual violence and torture response, and refer to some findings from our recent research on the organization and practice of torture rehabilitation services in Norway. When reports emerged of rape and sexual assault committed by Russian troops in mid-March onwards, fears was, and still is, that sexual violence would prove to be widespread and systematic. Human Rights Watch first published a report on one incident involving a woman whose husband was murdered while she was repeatedly raped and who was interviewed by international media accounting for her ordeal. Then, in early April, the Ukrainian ombudswoman stated that about 25 women and girls had been raped by Russian soldiers in a house in Bucha, 9 of whom had become pregnant. The soldiers, she stated, had told their victims that they would rape them to the point where they wouldn't want sexual contact with any men, to prevent them from having Ukrainian children. The account chillingly resembled war crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia some 30 years ago, where Muslim women were raped until pregnant and then held captive until too late for abortion. The Ukrainian ombudswoman reportedly received 400 reports of rape committed by Russian soldiers during the first 2 weeks of April. At the same time, a UN mission received 75 allegations of rape. While both of these agencies underscore that the cases are difficult to confirm or verify, it did not take long before the Washington Post stated that what is happening in Ukraine is one of the worst large-scale campaigns of sexual violence. Throughout April, protesters gathered across Europe to draw attention to and protest sexual violence in particular, as illustrated here in Berlin. An April survey conducted by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, found that 93% of Ukrainian respondents had heard of rape or sexual assault by Russian or pro-Russian forces, and 20% responded that they personally knew someone who had been raped or sexually assaulted by Russian or pro-Russian forces after the invasion started on February 24th. Almost 4 months into the war, investigations into these abuses and human rights violations are underway, and we still need confirmation and verification of individual reports and prevalence estimates. Political leaders, however, already refer to these reports as evidence of deliberate campaigns and strategic weapons of war. With a historical lens on, this is quite remarkable. Only a few decades ago, sexualized war violence was not only underreported, which it is likely to be very much still today in all societies, but it was also underanalyzed and considered a natural, inevitable consequence of warfare, irrelevant to analysis of justice in and after war, and to international politics as such. Making conflict-related sexual violence visible as a political force, as a weapon, crime, as a legal issue, as an advocacy cause, began for real with the momentum that the coverage of the Bosnian War created in 1992 onwards. With Bosnia, sexual war violence was made visible for the world in a new way, probably because of the geographical location of conflict and the violence in what was then referred to as the backyard of Europe. The distance in culture, context, religion, geography that we could otherwise immerse ourselves in, more or probably less consciously, and that could allude to a sense that distance alleviated responsibility, all of a sudden these distances were harder to keep. The conflict also coincided with an ongoing rights mobilization in the international women's movement and a series of international conferences in the preceding decade that had made violence against women as such the core of the fight for women's human rights, with special emphasis on legal strategies. In a matter of months, really, sexual violence in war went from the status of merely silenced to the stirring of outrage, indignation, and attention, with loud calls for its criminal prosecution and its framing as a crime. With Bosnia and soon after Rwanda, the discourse changed. We got a new language with which conflict-related sexual violence could be fought, discussed, and put into words. From being seen as a consequence of merely boys being boys, men being men, and women simply as the spoils of war, conflict-related sexual violence became perceived as, narrated as, campaigned against as a targeted tactic of war. It followed with this conceptualization that conflict-related sexual violence was no longer seen as inevitable, but as deliberate, as ordered, as tool, as weapon, and therefore also as something we could change, stop, prevent, with criminal prosecution and individual criminal accountability. The fight against impunity was lobbied and pushed and emerged not only as a response measure, but as the response, as both cause through widespread impunity and solution through increased prosecution and the prospects of deterrence. Today, conflict-related sexual violence is an important concern in international security politics, as evidenced by a long line of Security Council resolutions handling sexual violence in war exclusively, and in the ways through which the rights of survivors are heralded as a precondition for peace, as with the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Nadia Murad and Dennis Mukwege in 2018. And particularly relevant today, as illustrated by worldwide condemnation and reporting on sexual violence early on in the conflict in Ukraine, along with consistent calls for investigation and criminal accountability. Now, the mobilization and the particular outrage in response to the sexual violence committed in Bosnia and Rwanda in the 90s was fundamental for the UN establishment of international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. As Nora Sveås pointed out in her lecture in this series, the international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine is governed by international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and Protocols. The Rwanda and Yugoslavia tribunals, predecessors to the Permanent International Criminal Court, established through statutes, proceedings, convictions, and case law that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, and can also be part of genocide. Both tribunals have documented how sexual violence was used tactically, commanded, and once established, the two tribunals, and particularly the ICTY, the Yugoslavia Tribunal, have been absolutely central in the development of understanding of what sexual violence in war might be and look like. The tribunal has forced into words experiences and stories of sexual violence in war that we have simply not had access to before in that forum. Not least, the mobilization for criminalization and the statutes and practices at these tribunals have contributed a nuancing, too, of what wartime rape and sexual violence is. So let's talk a bit about definitions. Following guiding case law from the tribunals, the ICC statute has offered a guiding definition of sexual violence that applies beyond the strictly legal sphere. According to the Rome Statute, sexual violence is an umbrella term that refers to a wide repertoire of violence, including rape, but also sexual slavery and forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, and forced sterilization, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. The definition of rape, in turn, includes as a key element that the perpetrator invaded the body of a person by penetration, however slight, of any part of the body of the victim or the perpetrator with the sexual organ, or of the anal or genital opening of the victim with any object or any other part of the body. Now, I quote these at length here because there is a tendency that the term sexual violence or sexual assault is used interchangeably with rape. Rape, in turn, often implies vaginal rape. Yet none of these ICC definitions preclude either male victims or female perpetrators. This nuancing has, importantly, led to convictions for sexual violence committed against men as well as women. All right, so from being unthinkable before Bosnia, criminal justice is now presented and framed as the answer to the violence and havoc caused by war in general and by sexual violence in particular. So much so that the end of impunity has become the end goal of the fight against sexual violence. But should it be like this? The Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals operated for 25 and 21 years, respectively. And did I mention that a whole third of the cases that ended in convictions at the Yugoslavia tribunal included convictions on sexual violence? Not bad then, right? We know that in the wars in Yugoslavia, about 140,000 people lost their lives. 20 to 60,000 women and an unknown number of men were raped or sexually assaulted. In Rwanda, the 100-day-long genocidal attack killed about 1 million of people in a country the size of Oppland fylke here in Norway. 500,000 women were raped, many also murdered, and again, an unknown number of men. So, granted the celebration of the International Criminal Tribunal's prosecution of sexual violence crimes, the successful campaigning, how many do you believe have been convicted for sexual violence crimes in the two tribunals? The answer, 39. Altogether, 39. Importantly, both Rwanda and the states of the former Yugoslavia have had their national justice processes. So these are not all offenders that have been convicted. Their respective justice systems, however, warrants separate lectures for another time. Yet it takes a bit of optimism to mean or think that this result and this development alone has led to an actually experienced, felt increased risk of criminal prosecutions where wars are actually fought. We should not underestimate the symbolic meaning of these 39 convictions, nor international criminal justice's drive and impact on states' will to prosecute war crimes domestically themselves. Although impunity is still the rule, there is now prosecutions where there previously has been none. There is now legal recognition of harm where there previously has been none. And whereas conflict-related sexual violence is still a predominantly risk-free activity in terms of the probability of participation resulting in criminal prosecution, some are prosecuted, and there is political and legal condemnation and a will to act where there previously has been none. Yet this very simple overview gives cause to pause and question the dominance of criminal justice as the most important measure to prevent or respond to conflict-related sexual violence. It goes without saying that most of those who have survived or experienced this kind of violence never see criminal legal justice. Do not get me wrong. Pointing this out is not to say that criminal prosecution isn't important. Compliance with international humanitarian law is fundamental. But it is a reminder that criminal justice is but one form of justice and one of several measures to protect, prevent, and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. Justice is not exclusively about criminal justice, about punishment, or even legal recognition. It is also about opportunities, inclusion, redress, restoration, and community recognition and acknowledgement, about belonging. It is about social, psychological, medical follow-up, and rehabilitation. Moreover, criminal justice is important to many survivors, but it is not an absolute precondition for all survivors to be able to live good lives. Justice can mean many things, but our lenses tend to be oriented towards punitive justice understandings. That is, that justice and recognition is based on the punishment of perpetrators and courts' recognition of victim status. We are wired into thinking criminal law as solution. On several occasions, I have been on conferences and seminars where survivors of conflict-related sexual violence have been present, have participated, and have been asked what they need and want. And criminal prosecution is often, not always, but often, quite far down on the list of what their most urgent and important needs are. Yet moderators, politicians, and experts still opt for highlighting the importance of criminal justice and punishment, in particular, when they summarize based on the panels and conclude the event. It is what we are wired into hearing and mobilizing for. It's like we have already decided what is the best response, without properly listening to what matters most to those directly affected. And let me just urge for us not to do this here. Criminal justice is part of the toolbox, but not the entire toolbox in and of itself. We need to engage and make use of all the tools in there, and this is where you, professional health workers, come in, Whether the violence concerned is sexualized or not, you are needed. Importantly, as health workers, you can add to and complement the limitations of recognition that follows criminal justice. Because through its crime and individual criminal responsibility orientation, criminal justice and international criminal justice, for all its achievements, also fosters sensationalism through its selectivity and highlighting of particular perpetrators, and the emphasis on harm done to victims in order to secure conviction and punishment. It fosters a hierarchy of harm, prosecuting what it claims to be the worst crimes, putting other harms that can be equally destructive and harmful, but less slogan-friendly, harder to communicate and mobilize for, in the shadow, not only of prosecutorial efforts, but also political prioritizations. And thirdly, it fosters expectations with criminal justice that the institution is not fit to fulfill. Criminal justice is not an all-purpose elixir, nor does it end harm. It is not a sufficient solution. War experiences can never be undone. When I say that you can complement these limitations, what I imply, admittedly simplified, is that a health orientation can foster sensitivity over sensationalism, prioritize survivor orientation and individual victims' needs over the construction of harm hierarchies for political mobilization purposes, and rehabilitation and appreciation for complexity over the construction of simple solutions. To international criminal justice, it matters if the rape in question was committed on or off duty, if the perpetrator was friend or foe, if he was a member of a formal armed group, and if the violence was committed during hostilities. The crime and health orientations are not mutually exclusive, but for you, as health workers, these boundaries are less decisive. You can recognize harm and address victims' needs, also if the sexual violence was conducted by partner, in post-conflict society, in refugee camps, by peers or peacekeepers. You can recognize harm without the survivor having to testify before a court of law or before other audiences. You can recognize that violence against women tend to soar during conflict and in post-conflict societies, and that this violence too is conflict-related and harmful, even if the perpetrators are not troops and the human rights violations do not qualify as war crimes due to the status of the offender. You do not have to practice the hierarchies and dichotomies that criminal justice operates by. You can recognize all the harms that criminal justice does, but more, and you can emphasize and focus on the individual and his or her needs and agency rather than on what makes a good case for prosecution. That is a strength. Now, I recognize that you too have limitations and conditions, but in many instances, they are the subject of your professional discretion and time management, which is different from the black-white limitations of criminal law. And whether you are a psychology student or professional in Ukraine, neighboring countries, or in Norway, this is relevant. Because we are all interconnected. Almost 4 months into the war, 7.7 million Ukrainians are internally displaced, and 6.5 million has fled the country. As a health professional, you will meet survivors of war, of sexual violence, and of torture, wherever you reside. Whether you meet refugees from Ukraine or from other conflict contexts, they have escaped violent contexts, possibly war crimes, and likely grave human rights violations. While not all refugees have experienced violence, torture, or sexual assault firsthand, being a refugee do, however, involve losses. Moreover, the risk of sexual violence and exploitation does not end for refugees as they escape occupied territories and war zones. 2 days ago, the United States Institute of Peace hosted a conversation with the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, who expressed concern over the lack of vetting of volunteers in host countries. The huge numbers of refugees arriving across the borders and to host countries make the situation difficult to oversee, and the desperate need for housing, help, and volunteers provide ample opportunity for those who seek to exploit vulnerable refugees, whether right across the Ukrainian borders or here in Norway. James Dawes, a historian who has written a fantastic book based on interviews with aging Japanese war criminals, has written that atrocity both requires and resists representation. As a researcher in this field, I have struggled with this, with finding a balance in my work between accurately accounting for, describing conflict-related sexual violence as it is or may be, and shielding listeners or readers for such descriptions, not to sensationalize, foster disgust, or scare off or away audiences. In my recent work with Moa Lønning on torture rehabilitation services in Norway, I have learned that many torture survivors can struggle with a similar dilemma in a more existential way. In Bosnia, aging women are telling about and reporting their rape for the first time 30 years after the war. At the risk of being accused of exploiting the reparations scheme in Bosnia, applying first so many years after the war, they have not reported earlier because they have had to wait for their husbands to die, knowing they would leave them had he known. In Sweden, torture rehabilitation centers had an increase in refugees from Bosnia seeking their help 15 and 20 years after the war and their rape, as they had managed to push away the trauma until their children moved out. But then, as they got time on their hands, the trauma resurfaced. Norwegian therapists told us that torture survivors often do not share their experiences in therapy, some never, others not for years or decades, not because of shame or for the lack of language, but because they do not know if the professional helper residing here in peaceful Norway can handle their story, can bear it. And so they keep the experience to themselves, not to burden professional helpers with their trauma. But there's a difference here between the right and need survivors may have to tell and share, or opt not to, on the one hand, and our duty on the other to ask for, listen, and foster the space for trust and sharing on the other. We need to be prepared to document, to listen, and to invest time and know where to seek peer support and knowledge about proper rehabilitation. Today, in Norway, this is very much left to the individual health professional because torture and trauma is not part of educations, while services are fragmented and highly person-dependent. While much can and should be put in place in terms of torture and trauma rehabilitation services for refugees, do not sensationalize refugee patients so much that you are scared of asking for their story. What I mean to point out is both that we cannot force trauma stories, but when time comes, we need to be prepared to recognize, receive, and respond to them. And that time, knowledge, interest, and trust are key ingredients to identification and the rehabilitation that ensues. Now, for the practical rehabilitation work, others here are the experts, so I will leave it at this, and we can continue that conversation in the live session. For now, thank you for your attention.